I never thought that an ordinary Saturday night dinner at my parents' house would be the beginning of such drastic changes in our family's life. But here I am sitting at the familiar oak dining table when my older sister makes a stunning statement that will set everything into action. "I've decided to sell my apartment," Aurora announced, barely able to contain her excitement. I almost choked on the mashed potatoes. The apartment she was talking about was not just real estate, but a luxury 3-bedroom condominium in the heart of the city that our grandmother had left her in her will. "We're going to open our own Italian restaurant," her husband, Durant, added enthusiastically, waving a fork in the air. I looked at my parents. Their faces were beaming with admiration. Mom clasped her hands in delight, and Dad nodded proudly. "This is a great idea." Mom even shed a tear. "Darling, you've always had good business acumen." But everything inside me was protesting. Call me boring, but as a financial manager, I couldn't help but think about the practical side of things. "Have you really calculated all the risks?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Would it be wiser to take out a business loan than to sell your only real estate?" Aurora rolled her eyes. Here's the classic again. Kiera, always thinking things over. "Do you at least have a business plan?" I persisted. I glanced towards the living room, where her children, 5-year-old Beniamino and 2-year-old Paula, were carefree playing with toys. "You have 2 small children. If something goes wrong, it won't be so easy to buy a new apartment." "Oh, please." Aurora chuckled. "You don't understand anything about modern possibilities. You have to take risks to succeed. You can't just sit around and wait for success to fall on your head." I gritted my teeth. "But your restaurant experience," I began, remembering how she had worked as an administrator for only a few months before Beniamino was born. "God, you're so boring," she interrupted, throwing up her hands in exasperation. "That's why you're still alone, Kiera. You never take risks." I fell silent, shoveling the leftovers of dinner onto my plate. They talked about their restaurant, about the bright prospects, about the triumph. Not a word about a possible failure. Not the slightest thought about what would happen if their dream collapsed. Later, when I pulled into the driveway of my house, my thoughts were still confused. Grandma's house. I'd owned it for 3 years now, but it was still her house. I put the key in the lock, inhaled the evening air, saturated with the scent of lilacs, and remembered my grandmother. She remembered how, in the last days of her life, Aurora practically lived by the hospital bed, convincing her grandmother that that luxury condominium would be perfect for her future family. I remember my grandmother squeezing my hand and looking at me guiltily. "You've always been practical, just like me," she whispered then. "This house isn't fancy, but it's yours. It's paid for. And there is love in it. You will appreciate it more than anyone else." I unlocked the door, went inside, and held my breath. Silence. Calmness. Sitting in my cozy living room, now surrounded by my grandmother's old furniture, which I could not bring myself to replace, I could not help but think about how history repeats itself again. Memories of Aurora's childhood moods came flooding back with relentless force. I remembered how she threw 2-hour tantrums over a bike of the wrong color, how she fell to the floor at the mall if her father refused to buy her a second pair of expensive jeans. Or that memorable Christmas when she was silent for 3 days, raising her chin resentfully, because she was given an iPhone of the previous model, and not the last one she dreamed of. Our parents never resisted her whims. They admired her creativity, her ambitions, calling it a freedom-loving spirit. My worries, however well-founded, were invariably perceived as unnecessary negativity. Even when Aurora dropped out of college because classes are too boring and she needs to find herself, they didn't hesitate to support her decision. I shook my head, dismissing those thoughts. I had my own life, my own goals. After making tea in my grandmother's old porcelain cup, I settled into an armchair, mentally switching to work, demanding full dedication. An important presentation was coming soon, and my promotion depended on it. My team and I were restructuring the client's investment portfolio, and I needed to be fit. Aurora's dreams of a restaurant had nothing to do with me. Dwelling on them wouldn't change anything. A month has passed. Time has consumed me, dragging me into endless tables, forecasts, and meetings. I worked with renewed vigor, building a clear strategy, preparing reports, and convincing clients of the correctness of our decisions. And then, during one of the lunch breaks, the phone vibrated on the table. The name Mom appeared on the screen, and I had a strange premonition. "Kiera, you won't believe this." Mom's voice was literally ringing with delight. They did it. They sold the apartment and found the perfect place for a restaurant. I froze, holding my fork over my plate. What? He's right on Madison Street. You know where all these fancy establishments are. Durant is already working on the menu. He has such amazing ideas. Italian cuisine with fusion elements, can you imagine? And Aurora. Oh, you should see her Instagram posts. She already has more than 1,000 subscribers, and also a restaurant page. You won't believe how many likes there are. She will become a real businesswoman. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling my knuckles whiten. Where do they live now? I finally asked. Oh, they found a lovely rental apartment. Mom said it as if it was just a temporary whim with no consequences. I'm with the kids now, while they're busy preparing. Everything is so exciting. They're planning a grand opening next month. I stared at the financial report in front of me, but the numbers blurred before my eyes. Statistics immediately popped into my head: restaurant failures in the first year of operation. After that memorable dinner at my parents', I checked the data. They were disappointing. 2 months flew by, filled with work, deadlines, and rare quiet evenings at home. I even stopped thinking about Aurora's restaurant until a notification popped up on my Instagram. Invitation. An elegant digital postcard with gold letters announced the grand opening of Bella Italia. Admittedly, it looked professional. And so, on Saturday night, I was standing in front of a restaurant on Madison Street. I had to admit, he looked impressive. The showcase was decorated with stylish lighting, and the window boxes were full of fresh greenery. Inside, there was a warm, welcoming atmosphere: exposed brick walls, massive tables made of dark wood, garlands of twinkling lights crossing the ceiling with soft light. It was beautiful. It was like a dream come true. But can a dream withstand a collision with reality? "Kiera, you've come." Aurora rushed to me. Her hugs were warm but quick, as if they were just part of a grand performance. She looked dazzling in a designer dress that probably cost more than a month's rent for a nice house. She held a glass of champagne in one hand, and the bubbles soaring up reflected the light of hundreds of garlands flickering from the ceiling. I barely had time to smile before her lips kissed me on both cheeks, and then she turned to another guest, sparkling with delight. The restaurant was filled to capacity. Familiar faces flashed through the crowd: cousins, aunts, uncles, old family friends, and a whole army of Durant's relatives. Our parents were sitting at the bar, with a glass in their hand. His father's voice rang loudly, reverberating throughout the room. "Just wait and see," he was telling Uncle Jim, waving his hand excitedly. "Aurora will become the next big name in the restaurant business. She has a real entrepreneurial spirit." "Not like Kiera," Mom added, sipping her champagne. "She will probably work for other people until she retires. Some people are born leaders, and others, well, it's more convenient to follow others," the father nodded thoughtfully. I froze for a moment, then pretended I hadn't heard anything. Those words might have hurt me once, but not now. I've long since come to terms with the fact that I'll never be the daughter they proudly brag about at family gatherings. I stepped over to the snack table, picked up a glass of sparkling wine, and, meeting my sister's gaze, raised it. "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "The place looks amazing. I hope it will bring you success." The next few months turned into a series of family Sunday dinners, which invariably boiled down to reports on Bella Italia's progress. Aurora appeared with Durant and the children, or sometimes only with Beniamino and Paola, but invariably dominated the conversation, enthusiastically talking about how her restaurant empire was growing. "This is our girl," Dad beamed, listening to her in admiration. "I always knew that she has everything to become a successful entrepreneur. It's in her blood." "Not everyone has that kind of energy," Mom would invariably add, giving me a meaningful look. Aurora was grinning at me across the table with that perfect look I remembered from my childhood, the look of a man who had got his way again. But one evening, when the conversation turned to real numbers, I couldn't resist. "What does the income look like?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and casual. "Are you achieving your predicted goals?" For a split second, Aurora's smile faltered. "Oh, you know how it is with new restaurants," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "We are still building up our customer base, but we will soon become self-sufficient, and then profits will really start coming in." Something in her voice made me remember her school days. How she insisted that everything was fine with her grades, right up to the moment when she failed 3 subjects. I kept that thought to myself and just nodded, taking another bite of my mom's signature meatballs. The spring evening began like any other Sunday dinner, filled with the aromas of my mother's cooking and my father's loud voice telling old jokes. Everything went on as usual until Aurora cleared her throat and grabbed Durant's arm. "We have news," she announced, beaming. I already knew what I was going to hear, even before she opened her mouth. "I'm pregnant." There was silence in the room for a second. Then Mom burst into tears of happiness. Dad started talking about what a wonderful child they would be able to pamper. Durant sat there grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Beniamino and Paola, who didn't seem to care what it meant, started jumping around the table, chanting, "Baby! Baby!" I took another sip of wine and looked at my sister. "Congratulations," I said, and this time it sounded almost automatic. Something inside me tightened. I put my fork down on my plate, choosing my words carefully. "Are you sure this is the best time?" I asked cautiously, looking from the beaming Mom to Aurora. "The restaurant is still being set up. The financial situation is unstable." The room froze. "You'd think I just offered to sell Beniamino and Paola to the circus." "Kiera," Mom's voice rang out, sharp as a piece of glass. "How dare you? A child is always a blessing." She lifted her chin and added in the tone she always reserved for discussing my personal life. "You would understand if you had your own children. Or at least a husband. You're already 30, you know. You're not getting any younger." I clenched my teeth, but said nothing. I knew this conversation by heart. 8 months later, little Caprice was born. She was beautiful, Aurora's blue eyes, Durant's dark hair, tiny fingers clutching her mother's earrings when she picked her up. But while the whole family was enthusiastically discussing the new addition, I couldn't help but notice the tension in my sister's eyes. How Durant was stealthily checking his phone with an increasingly worried expression on his face. The truth came out 3 months later, at another family dinner. Aurora looked tired. Even expensive makeup couldn't hide the bruises under her eyes. Durant, usually self-confident and energetic, fidgeted with his fork in his hands, as if afraid to look up. "We're having some problems," Aurora admitted, barely touching her food. The very word seemed to cause her physical pain. "Which ones?" my father asked, frowning. Aurora sighed heavily. "The staff turnover is killing us. We changed 6 chefs. Durant wants to innovate the menu, but the customers don't understand. Durant grimaced, but said nothing. And the nurse clenched her hands into a fist. We had to take out a business loan to stay afloat. Numbers. She faltered, and for a moment the room was so quiet that I heard the clock on the wall tick. The numbers are not as we planned. I sat in silence. I remembered all my questions about the business plan, the risks, and why they should have taken out a loan right away instead of selling the apartment. But she didn't say anything. The next 6 months were like watching a car crash in slow motion. First, the lunch crowd disappeared. Then the dinner tables were empty. The restaurant's once active Instagram page is now thinning. The last post, the pathetic 2 for the price of 1 promotion on Tuesday, garnered only 3 likes. I found out about all this from my mother's daily calls. They had to lay off half of the staff. Now they close on Mondays in order to somehow reduce costs. Durant caused a scandal to the last chef. He suggested adding sushi rolls to the Italian menu. But they're just going through a difficult period, Kiera. This is normal for a new business. They can handle it. But it wasn't just a difficult period. By spring, it became clear that Bella Italia's days were numbered. Restaurants live on customer attention, but it wasn't there anymore. Debts grew, taxes were stifled, bills piled up like autumn leaves in the yard. And the final blow came suddenly. Their main investor quit the game. What now? I asked Aurora when we were sitting in my grandmother's house, where I lived. She rubbed her hand wearily over her face. We sell Bella Italia. How much can you get? Less than half of what you invested. I closed my eyes. And the debt? Aurora pursed her lips. We still owe the bank almost $200,000. And now, 2 years after that dinner, when Aurora announced the sale of the apartment for the sake of the restaurant, she, Durant, and their 3 children were left with nothing. No business. Without a home. Without income. Only with a mountain of debts. I almost missed that Saturday night dinner. Something in my mom's voice when she called to remind me of him made me uneasy. But despite that, I went. When I arrived at their house, the spring sun was already setting, spreading across the sky in thick smears of gold and purple. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside covered me like a heavy wool blanket in the summer heat. Mom and Dad were sitting stretched out in their usual chairs, with tense faces. Aurora and Durant were here too. The children were playing in the corner, but their unnatural silence immediately caught my eye. Caprice was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, and Beniamino and Paula, usually noisy and restless, were sitting with tablets, concentrating on their screens, as if feeling that it was not worth attracting attention to themselves today. I hadn't even settled into my chair properly when my father cleared his throat. Kiera, we have made a decision. Those words made my stomach clench. Your sister and her family need somewhere to stay, he continued. Mom jumped up from her seat. You have this big house. You live there alone. It's a perfectly reasonable decision. I felt a chill creep up on my skin. We need to move in with you, Aurora said, as if she were reading out the weather forecast. Temporarily, of course, she added, but there was no pleading or apology in her voice. My mouth went dry. For how long, temporarily? Aurora shrugged, looking at her immaculately manicured nails. It was probably her last professional manicure for a while. I thought about it hysterically. It's hard to say. I can't work, obviously. With 3 children. And I'm not going to flip burgers somewhere, Durant intervened, puffing out his chest. I was a business owner. I need a position at the executive level. So we'll need to stay with you. Aurora continued in a tone that sounded like she was asking a neighbor for a glass of sugar. For several years. I blinked. A few years? Aurora nodded as if it was a matter of course. Anyway, you're not using all this space. And let's be honest, Kiera, you're not getting any younger. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. The chances of getting married and having children are getting smaller. You're already 30, and you spend all your time at work. I sat there, stunned. Her sister's arrogance was simply breathtaking. But even more poisonous was the fact that Mom and Dad nodded, agreeing with her, as if my status as a bachelor and a successful career really placed the responsibility on me to correct their mistakes. I pushed back my chair and stood up. The wooden leg slid across the floor with a shrill screech, startling everyone. No. Aurora blinked. What? No. I looked right at her. You're not moving into my house. My voice was calmer than I felt. Not for a few years, not for a few months. Not at all. There was a deafening silence. I could hear my mom's antique kitchen clock ticking away the seconds. Beniamino and Paula slowly looked up from their tablets, sensing the tension in the room. Even Caprice stirred in her carrier. And then there was an explosion. How dare you? Mom's voice screamed, and her face turned red. They're your family. Your own flesh and blood. You selfish, heartless witch. Aurora chimed in, and tears were already starting to run down her cheeks. My children will be homeless because of you. Dad slammed his palm down on the table, making the plates bounce. I never thought that I raised such a cruel, indifferent daughter. What are you talking about? I said through my teeth. You've always been jealous of your sister. Durant said contemptuously, hugging the sobbing Aurora. You're probably happy that she failed. Are you serious about that? I took a step toward him, feeling rage bubbling under my skin. I tried to warn her. I was trying to keep her safe. I tried to explain the risks that she ignored. I looked around the room. But now that her life has collapsed, do you all expect me to just lend a shoulder? Because I live alone? Because I'm not married? I looked at my parents, my sister, and her husband. And I knew that none of them would hear me. For them, I was not a person with my own life, but a backup option. And at that moment, I realized that it was time to set boundaries. I let them scream. I sat quietly, watching them work themselves into a righteous rage. The accusations came one after another. I was heartless, cruel, selfish, bitter, envious. I was a terrible person, a loser as a daughter, a disgrace as a woman. When they finally ran out of steam, I spoke up. Do you know who could receive them? My voice was still perfectly steady. You could have. I looked directly at my parents. You, Mom and Dad. The room froze. You were so enthusiastic about their brilliant business plan. You cheered them on when they sold their only home. You told them what a great idea it was. Mom opened and closed her mouth like a fish stranded on a beach. Our house is too small, my father began to mutter, but I interrupted him. I warned you. All of you. I reached for my coat, buttoning it with steady, calm hands. I warned you about the sale of the apartment. I warned you about starting a business without a proper plan. I warned you about the risks. I looked at their faces. But none of you listened. No one even thought that I might know what I was talking about. I took a step toward the door. And now that everything I said has come true, you want me to clean up this mess for you. I stopped at the door and looked at them one last time. You have made your decisions. You have decided not to listen to reason. You decided to risk everything for the sake of a dream for no reason. Now it's time to face the consequences. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, closing it behind me. Their protests sounded outside the door, but I didn't turn around. The harassment started a few hours after I left. First came a message from my mom, full of guilt. How can you sleep at night knowing that your nephews may be homeless? Then voice messages from my father, soaked with anger. Family is a duty and a responsibility, Kiera. Didn't we teach you that? Aurora alternated tearful pleas with cool accusations. You've always been jealous of me, that's the thing. Durant sent me long, rambling tirades about how I was ruining his children's future. I blocked their numbers after the first week, but they just switched to email and social media. Then the attack began through other relatives. Aunt Susan called, sighing heavily. You're breaking your mother's heart, Kiera. Cousin Rachel sent me an angry 5-paragraph message on Facebook. Karma will catch up with you, mark my words. Uncle Jim waylaid me outside the office and lectured me on family values, waving his finger in front of my face. But I wasn't worried. I focused on my work, my home, and my peace of mind. Even though I knew my family well enough to know that they wouldn't just accept my rejection. So the very next day after that disgusting dinner, I called the locksmith. The locks have been replaced. The security system is installed. Cameras are placed at strategically important points throughout the house. And, as it turned out, it was the right decision. I was returning home from work on Wednesday evening when I saw them. Aurora, Durant, and the children. They set up camp right on my porch, surrounded by suitcases and boxes. Beniamino was sitting on a large duffel bag with a sullen look, picking at the zipper on his backpack. Paula was sobbing into a toy rabbit. Caprice was acting up in her carrier, making demanding noises. Aurora noticed me first. Kiera. She sounded relieved, as if everything had already been decided, as if I was just too late for my own commitment to them. Durant was shaking the handle of my door at that moment. A key glittered in his hands, the one his mother had probably given him. I turned off the engine, got out of the car, and without even coming closer, I said, "This key won't work." Durant froze. What? I changed the locks. Silence. You, what? Aurora hissed, looking at me as if I had just slapped her in the face. I went up the steps and stood in front of them, folding my arms over my chest. What were you waiting for? That I'll let you in? After everything? Kiera, for God's sake, Mom stepped forward, as if trying to remind me that I owed them. You haven't asked if you can move in with me. You took it for granted. Aurora gritted her teeth. We are your family. Yes. And that's why I know you. I looked at them, the suitcases, the boxes, the tired faces of the children. You were hoping that if you just showed up here with your stuff, I'd relent. But that's not going to happen. Aurora breathed faster. Do you want my children to sleep outside? No. I want their parents to behave like adults. Durant stepped forward. Kiera, we're not leaving. I smiled out of the corner of my mouth. As you wish. Cameras record everything. You're officially becoming a violator. Should I call the police? Durant stepped back. Mom sobbed. Aurora clenched her fists. I leaned toward her, lowering my voice. Now live with their consequences. I turned around, inserted the key in the lock, went inside and closed the door behind me. There were screams, crying, and indignation outside. I took a deep breath. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace in my own home. 3 months. 3 months in which I have never set foot in my parents' house. 3 months without calls, without messages, without an endless stream of accusations. 3 months during which I felt for the first time that I was living my life. According to Aunt Susan, who is still talking to me, albeit with disapproval in her voice, Aurora and her family still live in that apartment. Durant is still out of work. Apparently, his status as a former restaurant owner makes him too qualified for regular jobs. Aurora spends most of her time on social media complaining about the unfairness of the world. I've seen a few of her posts. Friends have sent me screenshots. When you've been successful all your life, and then you have to start from scratch. Sometimes those who are supposed to support you turn out to be the most cruel. Not once did she mention how she got into this position. She has never admitted her mistakes. Mom and Dad continue to help by looking after the children and bringing them groceries. But no matter what they say, I know the truth. They're disappointed. They're not disappointed in me. That would be too easy. They're disappointed in Aurora. She was supposed to be a star. Someone to be proud of. Someone you can brag about to your friends. And now? Now they whisper to the neighbors, avoid talking about their daughter's business, citing temporary difficulties. Now they're ashamed. But they never admit it out loud. I haven't spoken to any of them since that morning. And I miss it. I finally started doing something that I always wanted to do, but that I never had enough emotional energy for. I signed up for an evening course in investment management. I threw myself into learning, absorbing information as greedily as if it were air after a long immersion underwater. I've always liked numbers. Logic. Clarity. Ways to predict, prevent, and analyze risks. I've always been able to count. It's ironic that my whole family treated this with disdain, until they needed someone who could count. But that stage is over. I got a promotion a week ago. Now I am a senior financial manager. Own team. Your own projects. I have built my own life, and no one can say that this is not my achievement. They're still waiting for me to come back. I'm sure of it. Aurora probably thinks that one day I will show up at their door after all, with apologies, with money, with a new portion of salvation. My parents probably think that this is some kind of phase, that one day I will realize the mistake of my selfishness and break up. But they're wrong. I'm not coming. I won't clean up other people's mistakes. I will not sacrifice myself for people who have never considered my desires important. I smiled again. Not because I was happy about everything that happened. It was because, for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.